Yeah, so for this first seminar, I'm just gonna kind of introduce us to the topic with some ongoing research, which is, also not in a published, finalized stage, but it's more like food for thought work that I've been doing in Bolivia for the past 4 to 5 years now. And I'll try not to take too long because I tend to just go on tangents because I really like this work. But just as some background, I'm from Bolivia. I've been working in the Bolivian Amazon for 10 years. And I started working in a particular indigenous territory with questions of indigenous autonomy for my PhD. And then I moved to join the Natural Capital Project at Stanford for my postdoc. And with them, I kind of dived into the world of scenario thinking and multiple scenarios of climate change and land use change and how that affects ecosystem services and people's well-being. And how do we even define those indicators, and what should we be looking at when we think about these people-nature connections and assessing these rapidly changing processes filled with uncertainty. So it was a little bit of a new landscape for me, and it still is kind of uncomfortable for me to work at these big landscape scales. I'm very used to ethnographic work. So I've been trying to bring some of that to our projects. And now I'm going to present to you some kind of a synthesis of results that have come from different components of these projects over the years, where we've been trying to look at what information do we have on climate change and people's experiences with climate change. And is this useful in any way for local stakeholders or social actors in terms of their decision-making? Or is it just documenting very complex processes? So this is, I'm presenting today, but this is work that has involved a lot of different people. So their names are on the screen. Mariel Cautin, who's going to present later in the semester. Hector Angarita, who's based at Stanford and is the climate modeler in this team. And colleagues from the University of Beni, from different NGOs in Bolivia, and all different, and also local technicians with indigenous organizations. To give you some context, the region where that I'm going to be talking about is the Llanos de Moxos. So you can see the boundaries in yellow there in the map. In gray, you see the boundaries of the Amazon basin. So it's within the Amazon basin and kind of in that southern arc of the Amazon rainforest. And it's, I'm going to stand up and show you. Where here you mostly see deforestation for ranching and agriculture. You see similar colors here in the landscape, but it's those are quote unquote natural savannas and wetlands. It's not the same kind of landscape that you see elsewhere. And I say quote unquote because the natural, it's a whole thing to unpack. It's an anthropogenic landscape built through thousands of years of interaction between different indigenous groups and these massive floodplains. So it's an interesting mosaic of savannas, wetlands, and forests, and water and seasonal flooding are very integral to life, to the rhythms of life and production, transportation, and everything. And the problem, as pretty much everywhere else in the world, is that climate change is impacting people's production systems, people's lives, people's health, and it's kind of an understudied region and an understudied system compared to the tall rainforest Amazon. So we don't have a lot of information on what is happening and what could happen, but people have been observing different changing patterns in weather and suffering from that. So our idea is to better understand what's going on, and for that we developed a mixed method approach. So we have workshops with different groups of people, municipal authorities, representatives of indigenous organizations, of farmers associations, cattle ranchers, and fisher people all across the Beni department, which is a jurisdiction in Bolivia that pretty much exactly encompasses the Llanos de Moxos. And just talking with them about what they have perceived changing over time, how do they see the future is going to look like. And we did some participatory mapping with them and also a Q sorting exercise. So if you're not familiar with the Q sort method, It's a method in which you ask people a question and give them a certain number of statements that they can rank in answering that question according to which ones they feel more represent their, which best represents their view to those that least represent their particular, their subjective opinions and perceptions. So it's really good for eliciting subjectivity and people's perceptions about issues. And we did some qualitative analysis around that. So, lots of workshops all across this geography, multiple different actors. And we coupled that with some climate projections and hydrological models that I don't understand, the mechanics of. And other members of the team were in charge of, compiling that. And what's the word? Is it downscaling or like grounding different types of models for Llanos de Moxos using local weather data, climate data. So we did that for two scenarios, a more pessimistic and a more optimistic climate scenarios, depending on global actions, the action taken at a global scale. And what we found, I'm not gonna go into the details. So these are the results of the models. And what we see is that both for the optimistic and the pessimistic scenario, there are going to be changes. In the pessimistic scenario, of course, it's the same direction of changes. They're just more intense. So increases in temperature, decreases in annual precipitation, a fewer number of rainy days over the year, and a shorter duration of rainy day spells, so consecutive days with rain, and an increase in the magnitude and frequency of extreme pre-rainfall events. That's in the optimistic scenario. So you see some numbers there, right? Increases in almost 2 degrees Celsius, and decreases in water-related indicators between 2 and 5%. In the pessimistic scenario, over 3 degrees increase in temperature, and more intense decreases in rainfall. So in the pessimistic scenario, which it would seem like we're headed towards, at least as of now, at the global scale, you see large-scale destabilization of the climate system. And in both scenarios, all of these things get compounded by the end of the century. So depending on, it gets worse over the decades. People have been observing that. So if we pair that with the information that we got from workshops, we asked people, very broadly, what changes in climate have they seen? They also mentioned some of these changes spontaneously while discussing other things during the workshops. So we went through all of our workshop notes and looked at the responses specific to climate change related questions, but also, anything climate related during the workshops. And we analyzed that to see how many times certain changes were mentioned. So you have in the second column the number of mentions. So they are ordered from most frequently mentioned to the least, top to bottom. So higher temperatures, more unpredictable seasons, more extreme seasons, longer and more intense droughts, less water in rivers and lakes, cold spells, higher incidence of pests that people very explicitly attribute to changes in climate, warmer water and the bodies of water. And because this is such a flat area, most bodies of water are very shallow. So they are very sensitive to changes in temperature and stronger winds. And you have some quotes there to illustrate this phenomenon. I'm not going to read them all, but for temperature, for example, some representative of indigenous organizations in one of the municipalities told us that there is more heat than before this time of year. So back in September, we are over 35 degrees Celsius, up to 40. Before the maximum was 33. And there are, flurry of quotes that point to that same direction. And since the topic is flood and drought, I'm just going to read one more in terms of the droughts. People notice that there are more and more periods of heat and drought. Droughts are getting stronger and longer. And these observations we found to be consistent across different groups of actors. So ranchers, farmers, indigenous peoples, municipal authorities, everyone kind of agreed around these being changes that they have observed in the past few decades. And in remembering also what we call extreme weather events, this is part of a different project within the same umbrella. So this is work that Maria Cautin conducted in 4 communities, recreating timelines of extreme weather events with folks. They discussed floods, times where the rivers overflowed. Is that a word in English? Yeah, overflowed. Also years when they did not overflow, because remember, this is an area where floods are part of, just the natural functioning of the landscape. But sometimes they are big enough that the rivers overflow, and that's good for certain reasons, bringing sediments to the surrounding areas, but it can also be problematic for communities that live next to the rivers. So the key is that usually there is an alternance between years with or without that overflowing of the rivers. And they have been seeing that increasingly they are not overflowing for lots of years, and then a massive flood occurs. So the last recorded here, a massive flood, is 2014, but actually we had one in 2025, which was post data collection. And you can also see fires and droughts kind of being concentrated towards the most recent years. Granted, we tend to give more weight to recent events in our recollection of things. So this is people's memories, and memories are not perfect, but they are also an indicator of things that are happening and documented in several ways. And this is important knowledge about what has been going on in this area. So that's, what's happening. We have the projections, we have people experiences, and things seem to point in the same direction. So what's the impact of all of that in terms of people's well-being? We approach this from a nature contributions to people, so ecosystem services that are prioritized by people. And when we did an exercise to, across these different groups of social actors, to ask them which ecosystem services they consider to be more, that their well-being most depend on, water was, in terms of quantity and quality, was very highly ranked by everyone across the board. So we focused a lot on modeling what can happen to water. And you can see here applying the same climate and hydrological models to some water-related indicators. So the extent of aquatic habitats, quantity of groundwater, superficial water, and water quality. This is related more to land use change than climate change, but climate change exacerbates the same effects. You can see that as the years go by, you have a decline in terms of, in all of these indicators, you see a degradation. In terms of water quality, you see increased pollution. And in terms of quantity of water, you see a decrease for all the other indicators. And this is also consistent with what people told us. And we explored how they perceive this relationship between droughts and floods and fires and increase in the number of pests and some livelihood metrics or ecosystem services that they value. And you can see the more intense, the color of red is the highest frequency of mentions. So a lot of people made the connection, and it's pretty intuitive, right, between drought and less availability of water for human and animal consumption, and also for agriculture. And less so, but also fisheries that are a very important source for food security, cattle ranching, water quality, air quality, enjoyment of nature, biodiversity, and ecotourism potential. And with floods, you see a very clear impact on agriculture, subsistence hunting, so the availability of game, biodiversity, fisheries as well. And fires are, just across the board. Water in terms of quantity, quality, fisheries, air quality, of course, is very much damaged. Subsistence hunting as well, biodiversity, etc. So again, these are gathered from people's perceptions, and they match what the models are telling us is happening. So we're trying to combine these different methods to tell a more complete story of what's going on. And I have just one more slide. We did some models of land use change, and I'm not presenting those results. We just saw that land use change in the sense of the expansion of mechanized agriculture over savannas and wetlands exacerbate everything that we've seen so far. And it's a tendency that, that is kind of accelerating in the region. And here, these are the quantitative results of that Q-sort exercise in which we asked people to rank 26 different ecosystem services for nature contributions to people. And in the first column, we see the average across the 50 different workshops across groups of social actors. And they are ranked from those that got the higher ranking to the ones that got the least, the lower ranking. So water availability, number one in the average, and then you have kind of ranching, water quality regulation, soil fertility, and so on. But what I wanted to show, then we have columns for each one of the different groups. So you can see there's some agreement. You have the similar color patterns across the columns, but there are some differences, and there is something to analyze there, of course. But one of the nature contributions to people that we considered was climate regulation. You know, how much having functioning ecosystems that help regulate climate contribute to people's well-being. And it ranks across the middle for most people. Farmers seem to put greater value on that specific ecosystem service. And my interpretation is that if we go back here and we see, you know, just how badly some of these climate change related effects are on agriculture and directly affect people's livelihood, it would be very intense for farmers. And that's maybe why they rank it higher compared to other stakeholders. But the fact that it's kind of in the middle also shows, unsurprisingly, other contributions that are more directly related to people's livelihood, like this provisioning services, right? Water, food, air, etc. And regulation services tend to fall behind those because they're a little more indirect. It doesn't mean that people don't value them. It's an exercise in which you force people to rank things, and they understand they are interconnected. And so we shouldn't put too much on the quantitative aspect of this exercise, but it does show a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how much people recognize they're suffering from climate change, but are not necessarily on board to make the changes locally in terms of preserving ecosystem services that help even with local climate regulation. And you can hear that more clearly from, you know, cattle ranchers and municipal authorities who are like, yeah, this is a big problem. However, we do need to change, you know, convert agriculture because we need to feed our families. And so there are those tensions that are not easy to navigate, and they're very complex. And it's not to, you know, demonize any particular group of social actors, just that there are trade-offs, and those conversations can be really tricky in terms of actual changes in practice on the ground. Yeah, so that's about what I have so far. It's work that is still being digested, and that we are hoping to get published soon, but it's taking forever and ever. So I don't know how it will be received by the academic community, but yeah, just to put out there some thoughts about how people are dealing with flood and drought in this particular landscape.
I feel bad about the aquaculture.
Yeah.
Aquaculture is like whoop across the board. There's like no variation.
Wow.
It's funny also that with commercial agriculture for fisher people, it's like such strong, you know, it's just, you know,
Yeah.
it makes sense. But
Well, I have to say for fisher people, we had a sample size of 2, so that's why we see it.
Okay.
We have a lot more representation in the other groups. But yeah, there's, I think, a lot to unpack there, and aquaculture is, yeah, it's increasing in the region. a lot of people feel very negatively about the potential effects, like especially in terms of invasive species potentially getting off, because when it floods, everything is
Yeah.
connected, and it has happened in the past. And aquaculture in the region mostly has non-native species. But there are also some folks who are very enthusiastic, not in the, with the people we talked with, clearly.